Okay.
Jürgen starts.
Thank you very much for not only for the dissertation, but also for the perfect summary of the dissertation. I have a couple of questions. I don't know whether I should mention them all or only start with one or
Up to two.
up to two. Okay. So I think there is one major challenge in the dissertation, and this has to do with the methodological approach, not with methods. You are asking an explanatory question, but you are doing a qualitative research study. And basically you have two cases, right? And this, always when I read the dissertation, what always pops up are there other variables behind, and which you cannot control for, because you have two cases. And I wonder sometimes whether it would have been better to reframe your dissertation more in line with the qualitative type of study and look much more on the kind of interpretations you have. My question is related to a broader debate. There's a very famous article by Stanley Lieberson, written in the 90s, with a wonderful title, Small N, Big Conclusion. And he's exactly tackling this question. How can you, when you have two cases, how can you control this? And my suggestion would have been to rephrase it a little bit, to step behind this more explanatory framework. This is question number one. Question number two, I mean, basically, you frame it as a comparative study. But there is something else in your two cases, namely development over time. In both countries, we have a shift of policies. In the case of Peru, from liberal to more restrictive, and in Colombia nowadays, from liberal to more restrictive. So you do not only have one puzzle, you have two puzzles. And the question is whether the same framework could also explain the shift in policies in two countries.
Yes, it's your turn.
Yes, I acknowledge the difficulties of having causality or a strong causality claims when you are only drawing on qualitative. I think what helps establishing causality for me is not just the comparative analysis, but also the process tracing, which process tracing are good tools to also trace causal mechanisms within the cases. Mm-hmm. And I think this, the combination of these two methods is what makes stronger the causality claims. Whether it could have been somehow diminish the causality claims, that is true. I didn't understand in your second question you said that now there is a shift from liberal to restrictive in Colombia. Do you refer to current president?
Exactly.
Yes. No, my research stopped in the case of Duque. It is true that there is a shift towards restrictiveness, but there are not clear measures that show there are not as clear measures as, for example, the ETPB or a border closure as there are in other contexts. There is a discourse that somehow wants to not embarrass Maduro anymore, because this happens in the context of wanting better relations with Maduro, wanting to reconstruct the relations with Maduro. But it is true that still, and in fact, the new regime, Petro, didn't want to reverse entirely the approach. So far, I would say it's more restrictive, but it is still not 100% restrictive. Like 1 month ago, there was also a release of a new permit for the parents of the minors. So there is something in the discourse, but not yet in practice. In fact, the country didn't reverse. Petro could have reversed the ETPP, and he didn't do it. He carries on in its implementation. But it is true that there is a different approach to it, and that it will be very interesting to study it. Just that at some point I had so my dependent variable have to be fixed, and I left it there. But yeah, I think I think this will make my case stronger. That, for example, this element of the salience that Venezuela has in the foreign agenda explains very well why migration is constantly for Colombia a matter of foreign affairs. Because in this case, Colombia is turning more restrictive, not because of the population, but because of the relations with Maduro. It's important to have this to keep building this alliance.
Okay, thank you.
Mario, going to go ahead, and then we go to the screen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick, for this very interesting thesis and a great presentation. I then also asked 2 questions. And so the first one would be whether you could outline a bit more in detail your understanding of the political, because I was surprised about some of the categorizations of things you consider to be non-political. And so yeah, I was wondering how you arrived at this categorization of what is political and what is non-political. And the second one would be with regard to your theoretical findings, the contribution you want to make with regard to breaking up the North-South categories. And I was wondering, because sometimes you say you want to break up the North-South divide, sometimes you say you want to make clear the specific contribution Latin America can make to also global South, understandings of global South policy making, which I think are 2 different things. And so I was wondering whether you can tease out a bit more in detail what exactly you want to make in terms of theoretical contribution here with regard to debates on the global South, North-South divides. And I'm thinking, for example, about Tobias Berger's argument that the global South is still a useful category in relation to the global North, or the same issue with the quarterly Weisbich and Allen said, like, oh, there are global South polyphonies, and we rather need to look at the different different aspects of like politics that happen in the global South. And so I was wondering whether you can pinpoint a bit more exactly what you want to say.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the questions. So by political, what I mean in my research is that those measures that serve the goals of self-preserving the authorities in power. Mm-hmm. So self-preservation, legitimacy, and those refer to more short-term goals of the leaders. Whereas non-political are cost-benefit analysis of the policies. And there they can be of security, labor market, but they refer to effects of the policies for the country and have a more long-term effect. Then regarding the contributions that I want to make to this North-South divide, I can think of 3. So, for example, the first one is saying that northern countries have similarities with southern countries. So here I kind of deconstruct, because, for example, the relations between the sending and receiving countries matter equally in context of the North and in context of the South. This is one. But also there are differences between southern or countries that are considered southern. For example, in the Middle East, ethnic affinity has been considered as a variable that determines or always explains the differences between one case and the other. And this is because in the Middle East, the politics is around ethnic cleavages. In the case of Latin America, I don't see ethnic affinity playing so much big of a role. So this means that not all the southern countries are the same. And so far, the literature about forced displacement has been written mostly based on Africa and based on the Middle East, disregarding partly Latin America. And then it has emphasized, for example, this ethnic affinity as an important characteristic to help explain differences between countries. And I think my research can place it a bit. And another question is that there are certain assumptions regarding southern countries. For example, that southern countries are weak to respond to great crises like this. And what the case of Colombia shows is that it's very resilient, even more than perhaps northern countries, to respond to this challenge of forced displacement. And maybe there it's the vulnerable paradox that plays, because Colombia was vulnerable in the past and it's still in the present towards some groups. Then yes, it developed the capacities to react quicker to a phenomenon like the Venezuelan forced displacement. Thank you.
Great. So we move on. Markus Hochmüller.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, I hope Jonas can hear me well.
I can.
Perfect. And let me start by congratulating you for what is really a great thesis that I found extremely insightful and makes a really great contribution to the field. So congratulations first. And then for my comments and questions, first I want to reiterate what Marian just said on the political-apolitical question. So I'm not fully convinced by your take that expertise is something inherently apolitical. And I would like to push you to talk a bit more about that. For instance, take the logics of security and the people that you study. There are the former border czar Felipe Ramírez, the special advisor for the Venezuelan border, who has been the director of National Intelligence Agency, DAS. Christian Krüger, the Western Colombia director, also has a background in the former DAS. The DAS, for those of you not familiar with Colombia, has been a quite infamous intelligence sector that was abolished by these same people, actually. Some of his advisors that you may have talked to that you don't quote with name also have to be there. So this is a comeback of the intelligence establishment through the backdoor migration, actually. So I think there is a security logic built in that maybe you decided not to focus on, but I would like to hear your take. Has this been kind of relevant for the policy process or not? The second issue, I find it extremely powerful in your thesis that you unpack this bureaucratic infighting between different, expert, bureaucrats, policymakers, politicians, which is extremely great. However, I was wondering why you only focus on Colombian and Peruvian state officials and state bureaucrats, and exclude first the international actors that have been quite important for the policy process. They are kind of more like a context factor for your analysis, as far as I understand it. And secondly, and most importantly, what happens about non-institutional actors like interest groups, social movements, NGOs? Where are the mechanisms? Is this just decided upon them, or do they have any agency in shaping this policy to a certain extent, right? So maybe just walk us through with your decision to exclude, civil society and international community in your analysis. But overall, an amazing piece. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions, Marcus. So the first one, I think, is a very important question, because I think also in my research, I don't know if I convey it very well, but I consider security, if it's rooted in cost-benefit analysis, also a part of non-political considerations. And I think security was essential. One part of the ATPV, one important part or component of the ATPV, was not just the permit for Venezuelans, but also the registration of the Venezuelans. And only because of this component is that some bureaucrats, the ones that perhaps had a more human rights perception, made or convinced actors with Immigration Colombia, which comes from the DAS, from an intelligentsia organization, to adopt this liberal approach. But what they agree in the end, based on cost-benefit analysis, so non-political considerations, is that a measure like this will serve security more than, for example, leaving migrants irregular without knowing where they are and so on. This way, it would have been and it is easier to, for example, identify the migrants if they commit a crime. So I believe security is a very important element it was an important element of policy making to convince a lot of members from Colombia migration, which has those origins in security. So that's one. International actors. Well, I think international actors in Colombia, I do somehow deal with their influence, but perhaps I don't believe that they have the same, or that they influence the same way as in other contexts from the global south. For example, I think in Colombia, it was the Colombian government who had the initiative to obtain or to use the support of international cooperation. So no, the initiative came from the state. The state was already predisposed to adopt those liberal policies and then requested the support of international cooperation. Here I study mostly policy making, and in policy making there was not the UNHCR participated in the last comments after the policy was already designed, and some of the comments were partially disregarded. But the international cooperation participated through the Border Management Office, because in the end the Border Management Office was entirely funded and staffed by the international cooperation. But again, how I see this happening is that the international cooperation in the context of Latin America is more passive, and yes, it has its opinions on whether migrants should be considered as refugees or not, release their claims, but in the end it's the states who look for their help and then use their inputs to release or make the policies that they decide. So they are relatively autonomous from my perspective. Another non-institutional actors. Well, I think the public opinion and the media, for example, they did play a very important role in shaping restrictions in Peru. I studied the role, for example, of business in the case of Colombia, but I didn't find anything interesting in this regard. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Lily.
Thank you. Hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
So my sincere congratulations, Nieves. I know a lot of effort and passion went into this thesis, and we can clearly see that in the results. You've received my comments in written form as well. I'd like you to comment a little bit more on this question. First of all, in terms of the literature, and it happens to all of us. We start out with the existing literature, then we go into the field, and then we have to make sense of what we find. But this question whether a reframing, focusing more on bureaucracies in Latin America, which you mentioned, but more at the end of the lit review and in passing, and also this question of sense making, and how far it relates to the results, and how far you're using that now, in crafting articles to make sense and to use the empirical material that you have gathered. Because in some instances, when reading the thesis, I was wondering, well, is this really proof of a certain determinant, or is what we're reading showing us how these political actors make sense of what is happening, right? And that is related to the second question I would like to pose to you today, in terms of empirical context that makes both cases specifically Southern or Latin American, but also context that is different between the two cases. And here I put in the report, for example, hyper-presidentialism
I think my main contribution of my thesis goes to the literature about the determinants of forces placement policy. I think this is the literature that I engage mostly with. It's very diverse because there are determinants of all sorts of types. But for example, if we read the first article on the topic, I think this was written by Jacobsen. She points out institutional determinants, relations with descending countries. So I try to do something similar to her. I try to offer a wide range of explanations that I believe some of them could apply to some cases and some others to others. But for example, this question on when an issue is considered as a foreign and when it's considered as a matter of domestic, I think is a clear contribution to the literature of the determinants, but just going perhaps a step further. And in certain cases, I try to also clarify some of the hypotheses or the theories that were made. For example, there is this idea with regards to the illiberal paradox that illiberal regimes are more prone to liberal policies. And what my cases show is that in fact what matters, so the underlying mechanisms of what matters is whether the regime is accountable or not to the public opinion, doesn't matter so much on the regime type, but also on the vulnerability of the executive in power. So I kind of nuance a bit more those theories, but I think it stays in the determinants of the refugee policy literature. What is specific of those Latin American cases, and yes, and maybe that makes my conclusions not be applicable or not to the same extent to others. And for example, is what you mentioned, the hyper-presidentialism, and this makes perhaps the characteristics that I attribute as relevant to the political context, explaining whether foreign or domestic matter more, playing a more important role in the case of Peru and Colombia, because if executives or the power of executives might matter more, then it's normal that then the executive's strength also matter more in the explanation. So this is perhaps one specificity. The role of socio-racial hierarchies, I believe it's important, but I didn't get to study it because I think it is important at the level of shaping public perceptions towards migrants. And the thing is that in the end I didn't find, or the existing results don't suggest that there is a different public opinion in Colombia and Peru. For example, the research that was comparative and that compared both the case of Colombia and Peru regarding the public opinion, I have here the percentages. In both cases in Colombia, 73% of the population relate or made a connection between criminality and Venezuelan migration. And 70% of the population made a connection in Peru, made a connection between criminality and migration. So I didn't see significant, information about public opinion that suggests that somehow this is different. And I think this would have been the way socio-racial hierarchies would have influenced the response of the state. And maybe here I'm mixing again determinants with making sense of the policy, but both Colombia and Peru, while adopting positive policies or welcoming policies, use this language of we are here hosting our brothers. We belong to Latin America and we are all brothers. So in the end, I also didn't see a significant difference in how the elites that are making the policy perceive the migrants. So I didn't thought that this was a main explanation for the differences between my cases. I don't know if I answered questions.
Thank you. I think if I look at the watch, if I also limit myself to 2 questions, there is the possibility for an additional round for at least some of us. So I also go for 2 questions, and I want to also emphasize that I really liked reading the dissertation. As you saw from my review, I do also have a little bit an issue with this relationship between the interpretative and the comparative part of the dissertation. Therefore, I pick up what Jürgen said. I mean, I personally think small n comparisons is something wonderful that can be done very well. The logic that is usually behind it is close to sort of experimental research, right? You essentially control for all the other variables by picking two cases which are essentially different on one variable but very similar with respect to many others. And there my question just is if you could go a little bit deeper in such alternative factors that may make a difference regarding Colombia and Peru, and that may make a difference regarding the policy. I mean, you just talked about public opinion and you rejected public opinion, right? So I just give you two things that you may also show that there is no similarity and therefore was right to looking on this policy-making process as the major difference. One is labor market and welfare provisions, etc. That's something where you have not very much in your dissertation, and I just would like to hear a little bit more. Is it really absolutely the same in terms of labor market demand for additional foreign labor? Is it the same in terms of welfare provision and the following distributional conflicts and stuff like that in those two cases? That would make, I think, your case stronger. And regarding the borders, I just want to repeat, I mean, I'm not sure whether it is true that the closer country, the sharper the borders usually are. That's not my understanding, at least from a European perspective. But that's not the point here. My point only is, I mean, your major argument in favor of liberal policies is essentially that tough borders cannot be effective. And is it not a huge difference regarding the effectiveness of restrictive policies, whether you have a border of 2,800 kilometers or whether you don't have it? I mean, yes, it may be very hard to control those borders as well, but I mean, isn't there a difference between the two? That in a neighboring country where you have a common border of 2,800 kilometers, it's obviously very, very hard to have restrictive policies. That may be still difficult, but somewhat easier if you are not a neighboring country. And therefore, I just would like to hear a little bit more about how shall I put it? Your argument that the amount of borders do not matter.
So regarding the alternative explanations, the labor market is different in the two countries. So Peru has 70% of the workers are informal, whereas in Colombia this percentage is of 50%. And I believe the way this could have impacted is through more xenophobia. But again, I don't see what I have about public opinion doesn't suggest that Peru was more xenophobic than Colombia. If bureaucrats would have participated in policy making in Peru, this informality would perhaps even make bureaucrats push towards more liberal policies, because yes, if you don't regularize the migrants, then they will automatically go and work in the labor market, and no one wants to do this. And in the case of Peru, there were few or lesser trained bureaucrats, but the ones that I interviewed, they all favor regularizations, and they advised against border closures, but they didn't have voice in the policy making, so their opinion was disregarded. And regarding this explanation with the borders, so the study that I included in my presentation, for example, is about refugee applications, and what it says is that the closer the countries are, the least refugee applications are accepted. And I think it's a way of somehow asking people to go somewhere else. So I think Colombia could have still adopted other measures that are not border closures, but that are still restrictive. Like it was not necessarily the case that it had to adopt such a liberal policy. It is true that for Colombia, even more important for Peru, was to adopt or to not close the borders, not only because of the length of the border, but also because Colombia has armed groups and that control all the border. But I still believe that this only happens if bureaucrats are mediate or are part of the policy making. If not, this wouldn't have happened. I think those are the key people that bring those kind of pragmatic concerns to the country. And whether Peru had adopted a liberal policy, if bureaucrats have been in the process, I also believe so, because even if it was less important for Peru than for Colombia, because with the bureaucrats that I talked and that were also trained and that knew the border, thought that this was a terrible idea, closing the border. Just that they didn't have a voice similar answer to the previous question. They didn't have a say in the process, and yes, their opinions were basically disregarded.
Okay, thank you. A brief second round, and since I got lost in my alternative explanation question, I forgot my second question, so I open up the second round with my second question and changing the sort of tone a little bit and asking more general questions so that we get into a bigger debate. And I put it in a somewhat provocative way. I mean, doesn't your explanation sound very much Weberian modernization theory, completely anti-Global South? If the story essentially is there was one country which has a rational bureaucratic state that worked properly, and therefore they developed liberal policies, and the other state did not work according to the logic of the rational bureaucracy and therefore developed illiberal policies. What is the Global South aspect of that kind of approach? I mean, it sounds very much like traditional modernization theory.
I mean, one of the things that I want to do in my thesis is precisely deconstruct this South-North divide and saying that a southern country like Colombia also adopts policies that are based on rational inputs. So there is not such, yes, I don't think in this case, this south-north distinction is that relevant. And yes, again, I think Colombia showed super strong capacities to give an answer to the phenomenon. If this is what you mean, I don't know if I'm responding to the question.
Yeah, but I mean, modernization theory would never say that there's not the possibility that some states develop and can enter into the realm of the rationality of the global north. And in that sense, I mean, you essentially make the argument those who follow the northern rationality, they make the right policy, and the others make the wrong policy.
Yes, but I don't know if they follow a modern rationality. I wouldn't say they follow the example of, and in fact it's not true. I think they, for example, while adopting their policy, they both took into consideration the policy that Turkey used to face the exodus in Syria, so some of the Syrian examples, and they also took the US examples, so examples from different south and the north. And based on that, they crafted a policy that didn't mirror any of those examples, like it was a way more generous policy. So I think it really comes from them, and it comes from them, and I think they are the first country in being showing so much originally in the face of a large number of refugees. So.
Perfect, super. Who wants to go on?
I think I could follow up on that. So while you were giving your talk, I was noting down, because you said that Colombia drew on capacities they developed during the war. And I was wondering whether you could talk a bit more about that. And so I noted down whether that means that they basically learned from how to deal with internally displaced persons and transport that to international forced displacement, or what exactly do you mean with that?
Perfect. So yes, one of the chapters is devoted to explain 5 of the capacities that Colombia leveraged to face the forced displacement. The first one is its ability to rely on foreign examples. Many of the persons that were the policymakers for the Venezuelan exodus were also the ones which crafted the agreement with the FARC guerrilla. And they knew the importance of looking at other cases to craft their own policy, and I think this was essential. Another thing was the ability to coordinate between different state authorities. And for example, what Colombia did, and Colombia had done before during the armed conflict, is to establish an institution attached to the president that could mobilize the different sectors and could also learn from the needs of different sectors. And then with all the needs, make a cost-benefit analysis that informs the decision. I think this was crucial. The other thing is that Colombia has already a lot of international cooperation in its territory, and he has built trust relations with this international cooperation. So Colombia knew very well how to get their support. It had the trust and it could build on the support. For example, for this institution that I'm talking now about, which is called the Border Management Office, attached to the president, it was entirely funded and staffed by international cooperation. So this is a very good use of the resources of international cooperation. And what the policymaking says is that more than just money to cover the costs of the implementation of the ETPD, what international cooperation gave them is a lot of information to conduct those cost-benefit analyses. So I think these, yes, these 3 things are essential. I mean, the other is the armed conflict in Colombia moved from the center towards the periphery. So Colombia had to build institutionalization around the border, and these institutions were the ones that were in charge of delivering the first response to the exodus. So they knew very well the porosity of the borders, and they knew very well that closing the borders was not an option, because then people will cross anyways, but then they will give the money to the armed groups which are controlling the border, or the international, what it's called the trochas, no? the illegal paths.
Great. So, Jürgen, and then I would suggest if Feline and Markus have to add also a question, that we put this last round together so that you get 3 questions. Nieves, and we start with Jürgen.
I mean, the dissertation was written in the context of the cluster contestation of the liberal script. And actually I was a little bit surprised that besides the reference at the beginning, well, this was financed or something like that, but in terms of content, there's little reference to this debate we have in the cluster, so to the content of the liberal script. What conclusion can I draw from this? Is it completely ill? Did you learn something from the debates on collective self-determination, individual self-determination from the cluster, or is it completely useless for your question? Because there's no, you do not relate it to this. I'm not sure whether it would make sense, but it comes kind of as a surprise for me, because you are completely embedded in this debate, but it does not really play a role in your dissertation.
Shall we put the other 2? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I can go maybe because I can link what I wanted to say to both Michael and Jürgen. And here the key word would be the literature that does exist on Latin American migration and refugee policy making, right? Which you know very well, which you've reviewed extensively. And there these questions come up. First of all, what is a liberal policy? What is a populist policy? What is a populist liberal policy that exists in Latin America but not in other regions?
Great. Marcus.
A quick question on those liberal policies coexisting with rather anti-liberal or xenophobic policies also in responses to Venezuela. Did that have an effect in your view? For instance, the Bogota government taking a very, very anti-liberal stance under the governor there, under the mayor Claudio Lopez, for instance. So was that important? Did that, mitigate or like limit the impact of liberal policies in Colombia?
So now the final words are with you. And you gain some time to think about your discussion.
Yeah. No, it is true that the concept that I use of liberal policies is different from the ones we use in the liberal script cluster, because liberal, yes, I basically resort to or follow up on existing studies that call policies that basically grant more rights to migrants as liberal. And this, I think, only takes into consideration the part on individual self-determination and perhaps disregards the other part of more community rights, because those policies, as you can see in my thesis, are usually against the preferences of the society or of the receiving society. But I mean, what I argue in the last takeaway of my research here was precisely that policy should be liberal in both ways. So just not give rights to migrants, but also take into consideration the fears of the population. So I do have my normative stance somehow point to what would be liberal under the conception of the liberal script, but it is true that the concept that I use as liberal here is more restrictive, and it's only referred to individual self-determination. But again, I do see people demands regarding migration as something that should be considered while crafting migration policy, and this helped me to basically develop my normative stance, I would say. Okay. The answer from Felim is about ideological, how do Latin America position itself ideologically. So I think when we are talking about migration policy, Latin American countries have a clear ideological position vis-a-vis other countries of the international community, other regions within the international community. So their approach is to liberalize, because this is a way of showing other countries that they are not doing their job, or that the migration policy can be different, and that they could be different towards the immigrants from their territories that migrate to, I don't know, United States, Australia. So there, I think it matters this ideological stance towards the international community. But I think when it comes to forced displacement, the question is a bit different. Because then what matters is, in terms of ideology, is not the ideology towards the international community so much, but more the different ideologies between the sending and receiving country. So what we see in Latin America is that countries that usually have hostile relations towards Maduro, at least when they are considering foreign affairs, they tend to adopt liberal policies. And this doesn't mean that those countries are per se thinking that migration is something, or at least the governments, no, the bureaucracy is a different story, but at least the governments do not necessarily think that migrants are per se good, and that individual self-determination of migrants are good, but they have this political agenda. And then it turns out that left-wing governments, I don't know, we have, for example, Bolivia, has this speech of liberal rights, individual rights, non-discrimination, and however it never had a policy or a generous policy towards Venezuelans, because probably the country didn't want to embarrass its political ally. And at some point, I think in this moment, after so many migrants, or after many countries have a shared large number of migrants, the truth is that most of the countries act based on the domestic more than on the international on international affair. But in this context, I think one should differentiate between migration policies and forced displacement policies, because I think ideologies work differently for one and for the other. Yeah, and Marcus, the question of anti-liberal, how this could, I think probably this, yes, definitely the local actors, this also happened in Peru. There were a lot of local actors that were very opposed to liberal migration policies, but the truth is that in the context of Colombia, they disregarded opinions that were against. So they knew that when doing policy making, they knew that local authorities were not in favor, they knew that the public opinion was negative towards Venezuelans, but this is what they wanted to do, and they did it. Probably no, I think this posed problems to implementation then, because the local authorities are then the ones who should implement the permit, and this probably make implementation more slower. I think this is how it could affect.
Great, thank you very much. And that was a demanding questioning, many questions, and you responded very well. So thank you very much for this. I mean, now I again the unlucky duty to tell you that you have to leave the room because